A special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology for our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. And to help us talk this particular segment, about a Moabite city, an ancient Moabite city in Jordan, in south central Jordan. Matt Vincent and his wife Monique Vincent, both doctoral students. And maybe you could tell us about where you're studying and what your focus is. So, Matt, what is it that you're studying at the University of California, San Diego?
So I'm in the anthropology department, but I'm in a fairly unique program that is combining technology with anthropology. And so I'm actually housed at the Center for Interdisciplinary Science in Art, Architecture, and Archaeology, or is known as CHISA 3.
CHISA 3.
And that's at the Qualcomm Institute at the University of California, San Diego.
Anthropology, but you're really kind of known, you're certainly known well in Jordan and in many places around the world as the tech guy.
Absolutely.
So we'll be talking about that in our program. Mm-hmm. And Monique, you're studying at the University of Chicago.
Yes, I am studying in a Near Eastern Art and Archaeology program focusing on Syro-Palestinian archaeology. And
both of you are currently teaching at La Sierra University a class jointly, Jesus and the Gospels. We'll talk about that in another edition of this program. And what you're bringing archaeologically into that class, which I think is going to be extremely interesting. This program, we want to focus on South Central Jordan, the country known anciently as Moab. So let's think about these countries first of all, and then I want to have you share something from one of the what we call the pioneers who in the 19th century traveled throughout this region, Jordan and Israel, and kept records of these sites, and the encouragement or lack of encouragement for even you two to be excavating at Balu'a, because both of you excavate at Balu'a. In fact, I think, what is your position? What is your official position now?
Well, I'm one of the co-directors at the site, right. And Monique is as well.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So we have Moab. What else do we have in Jordan when we think about ancient biblical territories? Mm-hmm. So if we move from the north, we can look at it on a map in just a minute, but let's think about this first.
So to the north, of course, we have Ammon, which is dear to all of us as well, and then right after that, really crossing the biblical river of Arnon, or what is known today as the Wadi Mujib, we come into the heart of Moab, the Kerak Plateaus, we could call it. And then moving beyond that, the Wadi Hissa, we then cross into Edom, the Edomite territories, which is also where my advisor at UCSD also digs and excavates.
Right.
So.
And Hessa at the southern end of the Dead Sea, otherwise known biblically as the Zered.
The Zered, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we tend, when we do these excavations, to read up on what other people have said about them. So share with us, Matt, what at least one intrepid traveler, one of these pioneers, in some ways, many of them are pilgrims. Yeah. But what does this person say? They're looking at the landscape, they're visiting sites, they're trying to connect them with biblical sites. What assessment does this particular one, and who is it?
John Crowfoot, who was the director for the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem in the 1930s, was sent there by Nelson Glick. Nelson Glick, of course, was one of these pioneers who really surveyed all of Transjordan and thought that maybe Balu'a had some potential. Tells John Crowfoot, he says, go do some preliminary excavations, we'll think about this in the future. And from the beginning of his report, he's complaining about it. He's saying that even in motor car, it takes 2 hours to reach this place from Kerak, which is a journey that takes us 30 minutes today. Right. So of course times have changed quite a bit, but his conclusions for the site are as follows here. He says, as a site for future excavations, Balu'a does not appear to the writer to be attractive. So he's writing it off to the beginning. He has these interesting little insights, of course, to the day. He says, as the laborers that we recruited from Asmakia and from the tents at Jebel Shihan, they were tolerably efficient. Something very typical of these early 19th century explorers and excavators. He's complaining about the rains, but really, you know, we look at these final words here. But there's little else to be said in its favor. The place is so remote that transport is extremely expensive, and what is still more serious, the prospects of important finds are not obviously promising. In spite of the extensible late occupation, there does not seem to be much accumulation beneath the superficial remains. So he just gives up on it.
Basically
altogether.
writes it off, which is quite different from my own mentor, Siegfried Horn, who, when he asked several different prominent archaeologists where he should begin a dig, they all put the site on their list that he ended up going to, and that's Heshbon, or Tel Hespan, which is the beginning of the Madaba Plains project. So quite a different sort of assessment here. But you're going to tell us through this program that it's worth it, that it's worth going to see and demonstrate it to us. And I think maybe a good way to start is to look at a map. And so, Matt, maybe if you would come over here to this map and just tell us what's here. And we actually have another map that we can get closer, but tell us what we see.
I mean, if we start out, of course, we're looking at the southern Levant here. So, I mean, we've got the Mediterranean, Jerusalem's over here, and now we're at the Dead Sea. And as we mentioned before, so, you know, this is really the ancient kingdom of Ammon up top. You know, Tel El-Umeri, I think a site you know quite well, being up close to the capital there. But as we move south, it's really here that we can see the Wadi Mujib, this giant canyon which really splits the land. The biblical Arnon is right there. And this central plateau, this is the Central Karak Plateau, which is where we find Balu'a. Of course, up north here, this little section, you know, split by Wadi Walla, this was territory that was back and forth between the Moabites, Ammonites, Israelites. They're all trying to find stake in this place. So, I mean, this is really the territory. And then, of course, Wadi Hissa to the south here, separating us from Edom.
From the Edomite territory,
Correct.
Certainly later on. But probably, well, even those borders are shifting. I mean, we tend to think of locking these in with surveying equipment, but these borders shifted a lot. And sometimes we think of a river valley, a wadi as we would call it, in Jordan, as a nice border, but that's not always the case, because you would want to own the production and the productivity of both sides of this river. You're not going to give the other side to your enemy. So borders may have been in different sorts of places than we anticipate. So we do have Balu'a here, and Moab, of course, indicated. Biblically, what kinds of things go on in Moab? What sorts of stories come to mind as we think about Moab?
I mean, probably our most famous story is, of course, the story of Ruth. You know, she's coming from Moab, and even though she returns back to the village of her mother-in-law, this is her territory. So the descriptions that we think of, this is Moab. It's Ruth's story.
Right.
So.
And one could think of probably a number of places along that plateau where the Moabite side of the Ruth story happens. It's hard to nail some of these things down. In fact, it's hard to nail the site of Balu'a in terms of any biblical connections and so on. What suggestions have been made?
Probably one of the most common suggestions is that it is the site of Ar Moab, which is really a very generic term that just simply means city. Ar is a Semitic word for city. So if we think of Ar Moab, it just says the city of Moab. But that makes sense at the same time. As we'll see later on, Balu'a was a fairly large site, and so people may have simply thought of it as that city in Moab. But we don't know. Unfortunately, there's no textual remains at the site itself that have so far said, this is the city you're looking for.
You are here,
Correct.
and this is the city.
Yeah.
Monique, I wanted to ask you a question about Moab too. There is certainly, when we think about biblical history, we're thinking about this time we call the Iron Age. Talk about the Iron Age in general in what we call Transjordan, or in what is now modern Jordan, in terms of basic features. If we go back to the beginning of the Iron Age and then through the Iron Age, what sorts of periods are going on there? How would we think about that as context for the story here?
Really, for the term Moab, that is definitely, we hear about it when the Egyptians are campaigning in this region. The Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III records a whole list of cities that maybe he visited, maybe he campaigned against, or maybe just his scribes are recording some famous trade routes in this region. And there are a couple of the cities on his list that are possibly placed in Moab. So that would be during the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 BC.
Okay, okay.
So that is probably one of our earlier textual references to this region. And then later in the Iron Age, we have inscriptions from there as well. I think Maisha.
Yes.
That is from a little bit north of Balu'a, but definitely a large textual reference. Would you like to tell us a little bit?
Yeah, now the Maisha inscription, or the Moabite stone, called a number of different things. Maisha being the king, and this being found at Dibon, so indicate where that is.
Roughly about there.
North of this. It's a Grand Canyon. I mean, it is Jordan's Grand Canyon. We call it the Wadi Mujib today, the river Arnon in biblical terms. And so Dibon. And Dibon was evidently the capital where Maisha was king. We're talking 9th century BC. And we're talking an inscription that in many ways matches, doesn't match, it's like a passage in the second book of Kings, Second Kings. And so we have connections. Maisha's named, sheep are named, all kinds of connections. So we have those Moabite connections. And then we always have kings, maybe this is in their job description, fighting against other kings. And in the process, we hear about Moab and Ammon in the biblical literature, normally not in the most flattering light. These are kings that are in opposition, and so the battles in which they become engaged are told from the side of the Israelites or the Judahites later on. So primarily, would we say Iron Age is the major remains that are found, and so that is biblical. That's Judges through the United Monarchy in Israel into up until even the Babylonian captivity and thereafter. Certainly for biblical interest, that's an important part.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's look a little closer and identify some other, maybe some routes as well as some sites.
Well, just to help orient us once again, so we're looking once more here at the Wadi Mujib, biblical or known. And as we had just mentioned, this is the city of Dibon, as we talked about before, being on the north side. And this, of course, would have been a natural geographical boundary that would have separated these two cities from each other. Now, this yellow line indicates a possible route. And we're thinking about these major north-south trade routes, and we may be looking at the original route of the King's Highway. Later on, of course, it's moved over here. This is the Via Nova Traiana, which moved
in Roman times. Right?
Roman times, exactly. And it moves at 4 kilometers to the west. But before that time, this would have been the most natural descent into the Wadi and natural ascent back up onto the other side. And so we can think about Balu'a being strategically located for trade, controlling those north-south routes. And this would have been the principal one here. Of course, we have a desert route out here, which would not have been very pleasant. And then far out to the west in the coast of Israel, there would have been another route. But
right. Now, what this is doing is giving a little more significance to the site than Crowfoot would admit.
Right.
Crowfoot just didn't see anything there worth looking at.
Right.
But what you're recommending is that we have something here on a major route, and so significant.
Yeah.
So what do we have here, Matt?
So now we are actually looking into the Wadi Mujib, and we're over here at Lahoun, which is on the north side. It's another one of these significant Iron Age sites over here, possibly one of the endpoints of this Mujib crossing. But we're looking over here, looking west, and Balu'a would have been just in through these side wadis. So I mean, there's 2 wadis that diverge off of the Mujib here, and this western side of it is the one that ends up towards Balu'a.
And this is probably taken from Lahoun, which you showed before, and which has this trail.
Correct.
And we've promised to walk that trail sometime. We haven't done it yet, but we are going to. Okay.
Yeah.
Next summer at Lahoun. No, at Balu'a. We'll get to Balu'a. So, okay. So this says something about how people lived and survived. So where are we? We're on the plateau. Both of these from Moab, from what we would call Moab. So what do we have?
And this could be anywhere. Absolutely anywhere. I mean, this is, the quintessential look of Moab. And we're looking at, these wheat fields. Just anywhere you go, you find them, and of course, sheep. Lots and lots and lots of sheep. We think about rainfall in Moab, and it's less even than Ammon, of course, which is, 300 millimeters a year, 400 millimeters a year. It's not a lot. So they're not really producing a lot, but it's what they have. So they can grow some wheat, some grain, primarily winter wheat being one of the main products they have there. But sheep and pastoral agriculturalism would have been very important for them.
Right. Monique, you have done a lot of research in terms of the way people lived during the Iron Age, especially the early part of the Iron Age. The time of the judges is what we would typically call it biblically. And these two halves of the slide illustrate something about survival. What does it mean that these two slides are together, and what does it represent for survival in the time of the judges? And as we get into the time of the kings, more of a market economy develops. But this is an economy in which you had to survive on what you could grow or catch or corral. What does this say about survival, these two pictures?
Well, as Matt just said, the rainfall in this region is really low. So you're really doing dry farming, dry agriculture at the margin. So you really need to hedge your bets with different options. So you not only grow your wheat and your barley, maybe some legumes, but you take care of sheep and goats. Sheep are a little bit more finicky. Goats will eat just about everything. So you keep both of those, and they provide not only the meat, if you eat them, but they also provide the dairy and then their wool for making clothing. So they're really an all-around survivalist animal. And researchers who have excavated in some of these sites near Balu'a have talked about how when they research the agriculture down in the wadis, they're doing so much more than just growing wheat up at the top. They're also really heavily using the wadi beds. So they're growing their crops down there. Even today you can see the trees, the orchards that are planted kind of in spots along in the canyon. Where they have easier access to the water. They also, when you study the animal remains from these sites, that's a huge insight into their economy and how they're surviving. And they find a lot of freshwater crab. This is a little unexpected for us, but they're getting a lot of freshwater crab and hauling it up to the top to help round out their diet a bit. So they're not being picky about what they're eating. They're making the most of all of their options to just keep out of starvation.
So what do these two pictures say, Matt, about how people settled? I mean, do you have to settle to take care of sheep? Do you have to settle to take care of grain? Or if you then added a vineyard, or if you then added an olive orchard, what does that say about kind of the necessity of where you live and how long you stay there?
Right. These two pictures here represent the back and forth that we see, especially during these periods where there's so much uncertainty. If you have a year of drought, you'll probably focus more on your herds, and you will be more of a nomadic state. You'll pick up your tent, you'll take them to one place or another place. We still see this today. The nomads are slowly disappearing in Jordan, but as we've worked there in Balu'a, we've had nomads and their sheep wandering through. They're moving in a cyclical pattern depending on what time of year to different places to take care of their herds. If you're managing crops, obviously you kind of need to be close to them to make sure that no one's taking it or that you're able to manage it. And so it suggests a little bit more permanence, management. As we'll see when we're looking at Balu'a, we can actually see that there's natural springs there, but there's also been water management where they're actually making sure that they have enough water to take care of the crops, water things, manage things, so we have more permanence at the site.
So we've been thinking and talking here about biblical history, of course, and you've brought in the Egyptians. That's a strong interest of yours, I know. And now we're talking about life ways. All of this, it seems to me, is important in creating this archaeological, historical, we could use the word anthropological or kind of human survival backdrop for what we now pick up and read about in Scripture. And that's what enriches what we do when we read these stories.
Absolutely.
And we are so indebted to to you, our young, upcoming archaeologists, to keep us informed about that. Now, Matt, this looks an awful lot like an aerial shot of Tel Balu'a.
This is from David Kennedy, who's a researcher who focuses pretty much on aerial views of different sites, but it gives us a great opportunity to kind of break down what we're looking at. A couple things to point off right away, of course, if you notice there are some Bedouin tents in the middle of the site, and as I spoke about earlier, this is part of that cyclical activity, and even throughout the year you will find them pitching their tents in the site. But really the important part of it is, as we look at this northern end of the site here, and it comes all the way back, in fact it extends beyond the television, this is the Iron Age remains of the site. This is the heart of Balu'a. And this is large. We're talking about 30 acres of the site here. Of course, the entire extent of the ruins, and this is including things on the northern part of the wadi, in the wadi itself, it's about 70 acres of stuff that you have to go through. But primarily Iron Age through here. It's worth...
Iron Age, so we're talking what?
1200 BC
about
through,
1200.
yeah.
Do we have anything from that earliest part of the Iron Age? I know there have been arguments made back and forth about it.
There's pottery.
Okay.
But we have yet to find the stratified remains.
Okay.
And part of that is if you look at the ruins that are out here, it's this basalt construction that lasts. And so it's kind of hard to tell when one thing ends and another thing begins, because you just don't find the destruction layers.
Okay.
Looking to the south of the Iron Age, we actually are finding a Middle Islamic. So from about 1200 AD through about 1500 AD is probably some Mamluk period buildings here. This northernmost one is actually built into the Iron Age wall system. So this is the southern end of that building. It's part of that casemate wall system. But this and these other three buildings here are all caravanserai, farmsteads. We don't know yet. We haven't excavated them yet, but we can think about that. And then we have what appears to be some sort of Roman settlement here. And this photograph doesn't show it as well, but in the springtime when you have the early crops starting to come out, you'll notice that there's green patches, and then you have all this kind of mud brick stuff that just keeps it from growing. So probably some sort of Roman settlement, maybe to control that change of routes when the Nova Triana went on the other side. Maybe they're protecting this route that was coming up through the wadis.
So
who knows?
a huge site.
Yeah.
And excavation history here goes back at least in the last few decades to some Seventh-day Adventists.
Correct.
Who were they?
So Udo Vorschek, who was a student of Siegfried Horn, was the first one to excavate this in recent years. 1986 he begins work here. Previously he was surveying around in the northern part of what's known as the Ard Kerak, the land of Kerak. And then 1986 he starts breaking ground here, and he himself dug there till 1997, when he then passed on to Friedbert Nino as the new director. So.
Okay. Yeah. Shall we move to this photo then? And a prominent feature of Balu'a.
Yeah. This is simply known as the Qasr. And Qasr is an Arabic word that means palace, castle, if you think about it in that way. Some have suggested that this is an Iron Age building. We don't know. And again, if you look at the size of some of these blocks, and we don't have anything to really suggest the scale, but you know, if a person is standing next to this, they're only coming up to, you know, second or third row there. The building's huge, which also means that all of the tumble from around there makes it impossible for us to get down to the foundations of that building and really figure out when it is. Maybe it's Iron Age, maybe it's later, we don't really know.
Okay. Now this goes back to what time period?
Well, and this is also debated. Some think that it maybe comes from the late Bronze Age, some think that it comes from the early Iron Age.
So somewhere between what, 1400 BC?
Yeah, probably.
And maybe even to 1000, or not quite that far?
Probably not quite that far. It seems fair to say that it would probably be somewhere between 1300 to maybe 1100, kind of give it a 200-year range there. And of course, it is thought that this was found just to the northwest corner of that, or northeast corner of that building we were just looking at. So again, we don't know. That's debated. This is kind of some of the folklore of the site. But it's a rather mysterious stela that we find here, and it's got these 4 columns of writing that we have no idea what it says.
And nobody well, people have attempted.
Correct.
But nobody has come up with anything that others would really
Yeah.
agree with. Suggestions, but nothing conclusive. Oh, there are a couple of our predecessors, your predecessors, working at Balu'a. Who are these people?
Indeed. So this is Udo Vorschek, who we mentioned before, and he is the first Adventist to be working at the site. And of course, this is Friedbert Nino, who's now the current director of the project there, and Monique and I are working with him. And both of them, you know, Udo was president at Friedensau University, and then he passed that on to Friedbert. So there's some sort of connection here. President of Friedensau, dig director for Balu'a.
Right. And that must be in the job description.
It must be.
Okay, a few words about technology.
So really, the reason I got involved with Balu'a was these two devices that we see right here. This is what is called a real-time kinematic GPS system. So that's throwing a bunch of stuff out there. Simplifying it, it means that these two units working together gives us about 2 centimeter precision. So very accurate, very precise. And when Friedbert first approached me about coming to work on the project with him, he wanted to map in all the exposed architecture. So imagine using this piece right here like a giant pencil. We're going around, we're actually just drawing the walls as we find them exposed. And you'll see on the next slide, we can actually begin to see the walls as they resulted. So the black that you see there, that's 2010, we started tracing out all the walls. And the red lines in 2012, sorry, reversed. 2010 is red, 2012 is the black. And you begin to start picking out some buildings, some features, casemate wall systems, and start making sense of these ruins that we find.
So technology at work, contributing, what would you say, significantly to our understanding, or could we do without it? Maybe not today, but could we do without it?
We could probably do without this, but it wouldn't be nearly as easy.
Or accurate.
Or accurate. In part, what we're talking about here is establishing a base map for all the work that comes afterwards. So switching over, we're really thinking about creating a new era of excavation, new base maps, and we're really moving on from here. And you know, working with this, we can actually know precisely what sort of buildings we're looking at, and the more that we excavate, the more that we could fill these out. So it's a huge contribution.
That, along with other kinds of technology, one other type that you might be using at Umeri. What else are you using?
Well, we're moving on to doing some aerial photography at Umeri, and you know, here we started out with using a boom, a giant stick.
And we'll do more with that later. Good.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Monique. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this program has added some food for the soul and for the mind, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.